Hello, welcome back to Every Problem. For problem 48, just as with 45, 46, and 47, it says to sketch the graph of the function. Here we have h of t equals absolute value of t plus the absolute value of t plus 1. And this gives us kind of an interesting shape. So as with any function, if we have to sketch the graph and it's not completely obvious just by looking at it, what shape the graph should have, then it's good to just make a table of values first, and that way we can make everything a little bit simpler whenever we can. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's have t over here and h of t over here. And let's just do our usual -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. That way we can get the general trend with this. So if I plug in -2, right, we have this absolute value of t plus absolute value of t plus 1. Well, if I plug in a -2, that's going to give us absolute value of -2 plus the absolute value of -2 plus 1, which will give us 2 plus absolute value of -1. That will be 2 plus 1, which just ends up being 3. So when t equals -2, h of 2 is going to be h of 2. It'll just be 3. So then when we have -1 in, let's see. If we have -1, then we'll just have, I'll draw a little line here to separate it out, right? We'll have -1 plus absolute value of -1 plus 1. And that's going to give us 1 plus, and now when we have a -1 plus 1, that's just going to give us 0. So 1 plus 0, and that gives us 1. So I'll just go ahead and write 1 right here. I guess I could write it in yellow just to keep the same color going. Next, to save space, I'll go ahead and erase this left side here, and we'll plug in 0. But when we plug in 0 for t, right, we just get 0 plus, and then this t here is a 0 also, so 0 plus 1. And that just gives us a 1. Now, when we have t equal to 1, we do get something different than before. We get, I'll just skip some of the absolute value if that's okay. So when we plug in 1, we'll get 1 plus, and then 1 plus 1, right? So that's 1 plus 2, and that gives us 3. So we see kind of this interesting pattern, right? 3, 1, 1, 3, and then when we plug in a 2 lastly, that's going to be, here, I'll erase this one over here. I'll just erase the whole thing. That way we can start nice and fresh. So when we plug in 2, that's going to give us absolute value of 2 plus absolute value of 2 plus 1, 2 plus 3, and 5. Now, let's just make sure that nothing strange happens in between -1 and 0. So it looks like that's probably 1 the whole time, but let's just make sure. That way we don't get that wrong. So if we have this function t plus absolute value of t plus absolute value of t plus 1, when we plug in -1, we get 1. When we plug in 0, we get 1. What happens if we plug in something like -0.5? Well, that would get us absolute value of -0.5 plus absolute value of -0.5 plus 1, which ends up just giving us 0.5 plus absolute value of 0.5, which also just ends up being 1. So it's kind of interesting because what we find is that no matter what we plug in for t between -1 and 0, whatever we plug in for t, if we plug in, let's say, 0.4 for this value here, negative 0.4, excuse me, then this value here will just become negative, not negative 0.6, positive 0.6. And so they sort of complement each other that way. And it'll always sort itself out in order to just be 1. So that's something to take note with this. So now that we have all of that, we do have enough information to sketch the graph. So let's go ahead and do that. And we have something like this with h of t and t. And let's see, at negative 2, I'll do the spots every 2, so something like that. At negative 2, we have positive 3. At negative 1, we have 1. At 0, we have 1. At 1, we also have, oh, let's see, my positive 3 is in the wrong spot. At negative 2, we have positive 3, which is way up here. There we go. At 1, we also have positive 3, and at 2, we have positive 5. So we see that our graph is doing something like this. It looks like your standard absolute value function, except instead of having that really harsh corner as you approach the x-axis, it sort of just flattens out instead. That's kind of interesting, but all of that aside, that's everything with this problem. So thank you, and I hope it helps.